Ben Pearson, the Roadster Tracker. So today we saw the launch of the Starliner spacecraft, which is Boeing's part to the Commercial Crew Program, the Crew Dragon being SpaceX's part, which composed the two parts of this program. Starliner has been in development just as long as Crew Dragon has for a number of years here, and we finally got to see it go into flight. And it has a little bit of an unusual path to orbit that's different than any other vehicle that I'm really aware of. You see, the spacecraft launches on the Atlas V rocket, and it's entirely prepared to abort at any point in time. It has these large reserves of fuel to do that, and it'll have to take off the rocket. Well, you still have this fuel that is around with you reach the final stage, and so you may as well do something with it. And so the Starliner spacecraft has decided to use this fuel to kick it into the final part of the orbit. Part of the reason why this is important is because the Atlas rocket takes a little bit of a less efficient trajectory in order to be more efficient in saving lives should an abort be necessary. What a normal rocket launch likes to do is head almost straight up, kind of curve off at an angle, then start to accelerate horizontally. That will allow you to use only a less powerful engine on the upper stage, which is generally speaking a good thing for efficiency, but it required two engines because of this unique trajectory in order to allow for saving of lives. If you are trying to re-enter, you don't want to go straight down, you want to go mostly horizontally. And so this trajectory will allow them to safely re-enter at any time. Well, the Starliner launched into space absolutely perfectly. Props to ULA, you guys did good. And then things started to get interesting. You see, Starliner had its own spacecraft. It had the mission event time, which is basically the time since launch. And for some unknown reason, this time was off. This caused a few interesting issues that happened along the way. The first one is the spacecraft didn't actually perform its orbital insertion to get it the rest of the way there using these orbital abort motors that it has. Which was okay. This was actually part of the plan that they had a backup procedure to deal with this. Well, the spacecraft still seemed to think for some reason that it was actually thrusting, and so it started using its thrusters quite a bit to maintain the station keeping. See, when you're just coasting along, you don't really care that much how precise. You want to keep a reasonable window, but you don't care exactly. But when you're thrusting, you really need to be pointing in a very specific direction, so it will use a lot more power to really hone in on that. But especially when you're still in the atmosphere, you don't want to be as tightly focused, especially right after you separate from the spacecraft. So it started to have all kinds of thrusters, and we started to see this on the screens that were showing when they were broadcasting this. So, okay, something unusual is going on. What exactly is that? I'm no longer going to talk about what we noticed at home watching, but what we found out later through the press conference and other means that happened. When the spacecraft was supposed to perform this orbital insertion, it didn't. And there's a very limited amount of time. When you're in this suborbital trajectory, you have maybe 50-ish minutes before you crash into the ocean. And you really only have a window of maybe 20 minutes where you can even do anything to keep the spacecraft from completely crashing into the ground. Now, I want to stress this. If there had been astronauts on board, they would have been safe. Even if the motors had not fired at this point in time, they still would have came and landed in the ocean. They would have been off the coast of Australia. It would have been a pain to go fish them out, but they would have still been alive. The contingency procedure required, after about 7 to 8 minutes of the spacecraft not firing its motors, to try to fire it again. They tried to fire it again. They were not able to contact the spacecraft. Now, Boeing uses the TDRS spacecraft, which are these data relay spacecraft that are in geosynchronous orbit, and I think they're in a few other spots, that are used to keep in constant contact with the ISS, with the space shuttle, with other things. Well, because this is a human-rated spacecraft, they go through the TDRS system. At the particular point where they were commanding it, there was a little bit of a gap in coverage, and they weren't able to maintain perfect things. They're not exactly sure why that was, but the theory is because it was kind of between satellites, and so it didn't have a really good signal. I'm sure we'll learn more about that soon. So they commanded the spacecraft. It didn't actually go into the proper system because they didn't have this good enough connection, and the second opportunity failed. This is where they started to get a little bit desperate, and they went down to the bottom of the contingency. And the last contingency is what I'll call an abort to orbit. That's the general pattern for how these things go. Basically, you take the spacecraft and you say, we don't really care about anything else. We just want to make sure that we get to a orbit, and then we can land at a place and time of our choosing. This was used by one of the space shuttle missions that had one of the main engines go out. It managed to make it into an orbit, landed safely. They couldn't complete the primary mission, but everyone was safe, and this is a perfectly acceptable outcome. So they chose an orbit that would allow them to land at White Sands in 2 days, 48 hours roughly after they launched. So they executed that, and that maneuver performed fine, so the spacecraft was safe. It's in a stable orbit. But when they started to look at the fuel, saying, okay, can we make it to the space station with this? They've determined that they don't have a sufficient reserve to be able to make this, because it took more fuel between the thrusters firing all of the time and also firing at a less optimal point to an orbit that wasn't really the one that's intended to go to the space station. They just don't have enough fuel. Okay, what does all of this mean? Well, the primary mission of this Starliner demonstration mission was to demonstrate that they could do a safe launch trajectory, which they did. The mission goes all the way there. It's great. Second one is to demonstrate that they can land safely. They'll still have the opportunity to do that on Sunday morning. There are a lot of secondary objectives. One of them is docking to the space station to demonstrate that all of the docking systems work. This is a secondary system because you can still actually test this with humans in the loop, and it's not really any less safe. It took me a little while to come to this, but it's not really any less safe. See, if you think about it, the astronauts on the space station are in just as much danger when a spacecraft comes to dock as anybody that would be in the spacecraft. We've even had an incident where one spacecraft rammed into a space station, caused all kinds of nasty stuff. The space station Mir almost had to be evacuated because of this, to be honest. But we've learned a lot since then, and that kind of stuff has not happened since. It seems likely that when the Starliner spacecraft goes to dock with the space station, they'll have to take a little bit of extra time, precautions to make sure it's working, but the Crew Dragon was able to dock with the space station in less than a day. It's entirely possible that Starliner will be able to do the same thing too with Crew, and they can survive for several days in orbit. It's not really that big of a deal. It's something they'll have to just be more cautious about, and another extra hurdle of testing for their final mission, but it's something that is entirely possible. Okay, so what about the rest of the objectives? Well, they want to be able to do some practicing with orbital maneuvers to make sure that they can safely approach the space station. They can probably still do that. They also want to be able to demonstrate the landing safely. This, to me, is the biggest thing. The rocket, they pretty much have figured out how to do that kind of stuff safely, but the landing is crucially important. And they did a demonstration of the launch abort system here recently from White Sands. And, well, the landing, they managed to land, but they only fired 2 of the 3 parachutes, and the spacecraft is rated to do that. It could probably even land with only a single one, and the astronauts would be a little jarred up, but they'd still be safe. But still, it's not a really warm fuzzy. So hopefully, Starliner will land at White Sands on Sunday morning, and all of the parachutes will deploy, and they'll be able to demonstrate these absolutely critical systems. Hopefully, it'll all work out pretty nicely. What does this mean as far as Boeing is concerned? Well, they have to figure out exactly what caused this. They don't know why the mission event timer was off. They have to see, can this creep up in some things? Was it like a radiation strike? That's something you can't really model that well. So they'll have to do some testing of that, or more likely it was some weird configuration that they hadn't tested. You see, they'll test the stuff on the ground like crazy. You have hardware in the loop simulations where you're taking real flight hardware, you're punching in simulated data into them, and making sure that they function in a reasonable manner. None of this stuff saw this error that they popped up. So something really, really funny happened. We don't know what it is, but the astronauts would have been safe if they were on here, and they've been able to demonstrate the safety system so far. As long as it lands on Sunday, I think this will lead to a delay of maybe a couple of months in order to land humans or launch humans there. They also might not be able to stay on the station for as long of a time. You see, the first Boeing commercial crew mission, they were planning on keeping the astronauts there for maybe even 6 months. They might not be doing that. It might just be a quick flight there, stay for a little bit, and come back down, similar to how the Crew Dragon is proposed on doing. Not really sure how it's going to work out, but it is really interesting to see. Thank you guys so much for joining me. Let me know whatever questions or comments you guys have. And, come check me out in my Discord. I was able to talk through some of these points in a little bit more details. If you want to talk with me more, you can do that, or just leave a note in the comments below. Thank you guys for all of your support. You guys are awesome. And until next time, keep on tracking. Take care.